It almost feels like the experience of digging deeper and deeper into this nest of vipers in order to get to the truth, and ultimately finding that the truth that lies within is actually really ugly and heartbreaking. This is Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. Melchor is a Mexican writer. She's written several novels, although I haven't read anything else by her yet. This is my first touch with any of her writing. She is probably most well known for this, Hurricane Season, although she also has a novel called Paradiso, which I am really excited to read at some point, which I've heard great things about and is also rather well known. The edition that I read was the Fitzcarraldo edition. I really love these editions. I think the kind of very minimalist cover design is beautiful, and I find that the way that they're set is very legible and simple and elegant. This particular version was translated by Sophie Hughes, and I want to mention it up front just because even before I go into detail about the writing style and the content of this book, I have an incredible amount of admiration for anybody who's able to translate literature from another language, but especially with something that's this specific and dense and colloquial. I felt totally immersed in this, and the language felt organic, and that is no small feat. So obviously, as much as that is a testament to the incredible talent of Melchor as a writer, I also wanted to shout out Sophie Hughes, the translator, for her incredible work in making this available to a non-Spanish speaking audience. Very briefly, this book is essentially about a local legend in a small, very destitute, rundown village in Mexico, in the state of Veracruz or somewhere nearby. And the legend centers around a person in this village who is kind of famously referred to as a local witch. The witch is actually murdered very early on in the story, and from there we slowly start to unravel what actually transpired through the various perspectives of people who were either tangentially involved in the murder or people who observed things over the few days that these events occurred. From a content and theme point of view, this book is really dark and difficult. It is a pretty unfiltered look at a lot of the uglier side of human nature, and that includes many references to rape, abuse, violence, sexual assault, homophobia, other forms of prejudice. It's a really ugly book in a lot of ways, at least as far as subject matter goes. But the reason why I loved this book so much and why I think it's really worth reading has to do with two things mostly. Number one is the structure and the way that the story unfolds, and number two has to do with Melchor's writing style. I'll start by describing the structure in a little bit more detail because to me this is one of the great successes of the novel, and something that I don't know that I've seen done quite as deftly as Melchor is able to do it anywhere else before. Essentially, the way that the novel is structured is that the opening chapter is very zoomed out, and we get a kind of third-person objective introduction to the world and the characters, in particular the witch, who is kind of the central character of the novel. And it's also treated in a way where you get a sense almost that we are in a timeless place. There is no real reference to any form of modernity, and because of the repeated kind of fabulistic language referring to witches and magic and potions, it feels very much outside of a specific era in time. There is also this inherent sense of folklore that's built into that introduction, where you are experiencing the tale of something that feels pseudo-magical without really understanding what's real and what's not, what is actually the truth, whether this is going to veer into the territory of magical realism or if this is going to remain realistic and we're just getting a subjective and skewed perspective. From that very objective and mythic introduction, Melchor then plunges us into a series of very, very subjective and grounded points of view. These points of view shift between various characters throughout the book, and they tend to get closer and closer to the actual scene of the murder and the truth as time passes. And this structural technique has the effect of not only revealing the truth and more information as time goes on, but also kind of peeling back the layers of myth to reveal the ugliness that actually exists at the heart of the story. So much of the language that's used here, especially in the first few chapters when characters are referring to the witch and some of the other characters in the book, is incredibly misogynistic and homophobic and prejudiced. It's dripping with a sense of hatred often that is quite ugly to read, actually. But it's also very purposeful, because what it does is ground you as a reader in the narrative world in a very immediate and visceral way. And it also sets up this dynamic of how our subjective impressions of the world around us differ from the actual objective reality, which for me is one of the central questions or topics that Melchor seems to be dealing with in this text. How does our subjective view of events and people influence the reality of the world? When you start reading this book, you think that the witch is one kind of person and that the people who have vilified her might be in the right because of the pervasive legends and myths and gossip that surround this character of a witch. But as the truth becomes more and more clear and the layers get peeled back, you realize that what is actually happening is a lot more heartbreaking and a lot more despicable. And the way that Melchor structures this to have it be revealed through the various perspectives is really, really brilliant. The other big success of this book for me has to do with the particular style of prose that Melchor uses. I believe that this is standard for her, that she uses this kind of writing in her other work as well, at least from what I've heard. But it is very specific, and it is the kind of writing that sometimes I shy away from. She uses really long run-on sentences that feel like they are essentially stream of consciousness, and they oftentimes do not have a lot of punctuation. They will sometimes run for entire pages at a time without a break. And this style of writing, which I've read in several other writers' work before, most of the time feels excessive and a little bit too cerebral or stylistic and doesn't serve the purpose of the book necessarily. I'm thinking of people like Krasznahorkai, mostly actually. But I think Melchor is different because the way that she writes does something precise and specific to help in your engagement with the book and also to immerse you in a world. Her particular version of stream of consciousness works because it feels almost like oral storytelling. It feels like you are listening to people gossip and talk about the story out loud as opposed to reading something that's written. It does have this quality of relentlessness, and the pace can sometimes be a little bit breakneck, where you're going for pages and pages, chugging along inside the brains and experiences of these characters. And when you couple that with some of the more challenging contextual material that's in here as well, it can be really, really overwhelming. But when you zoom out and look at it from the bigger picture, what she's essentially done is mirrored the way that information is passed in a real community through gossip and hearsay, where a lot of the times the truth is something that nobody actually knows. And that combination of the relentless prose with the structural elements that she's included and the central elements of the plot, which center around a character who is deeply misunderstood, all come together to create a very vivid and immersive reading experience. There's a few books that this reminded me of, which I'm going to talk through briefly now. But before I do that, I would highly encourage you to go and watch the interview that I've linked below. This is an interview that Melchor did in Berlin after the release of the German translation of Hurricane Season, which I believe actually came out before the English translation. But it gives a really great personal insight into some of her thinking behind the work and exactly what she was going for. If you've read Hurricane Season or you're about to read Hurricane Season and you're looking for some additional material to read afterwards, the first book that I would point you towards is Light in August by William Faulkner. Chances are, if you've read Hurricane Season, you might have already read this as well, but if not, I would definitely recommend picking it up. Faulkner, I hope, needs no introduction. He is, of course, one of the all-time greats. I have a contentious relationship with his writing. I do like some of his work. I don't always love what he's doing, but Light in August is probably my favorite of his novels, and I think especially if you're into that very subjective and immersive, almost rhythmic quality of Melchor's prose, then you probably would enjoy large parts of Light in August as well. The next one is another recommendation for people who are into that subjective and immersive point of view writing. This is Suttree by Cormac McCarthy. He's another writer that I don't love all the time, although I do think this particular book is really fantastic. He is also, in a different way than Melchor, is quite dense in his style of prose. He's very textural in his use of language. I don't think he's as relentless as Melchor is, but I would highly recommend picking this up if you like stories where you feel like you're really living inside the subjective realities of the main characters. The next one is something I hesitate to recommend because it's not a book that I actually enjoyed, but I do understand that if you're into the writing style that Melchor employs in Hurricane Season, so that very stream of consciousness, run-on sentences, walls of text kind of writing, if that's something that you really enjoy and feel like you want to engage with more, then definitely pick something up by Laszlo Krasznahorkai. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature last year, of course. This is the only book I've read from him. It's probably his most famous. It's The Melancholy of Resistance. For me, he's a little bit too dry and cerebral and intellectual, but of course that's really subjective, and that might be something you enjoy more than I do. And the last book I'll recommend is another writer who uses a similar kind of prose. He is maybe a little bit less loquacious, although he is famously the kind of person who will write a sentence that stretches over a page or 2 pages. This is José Saramago. He was also a Nobel Prize winner. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1998. He is probably one of the most famous Portuguese writers. This is his most well-known book. It's called Blindness. This is a really fantastic book. I think there's a lot of similarities actually between Hurricane Season and this book. It is not only relentless in the same way that Hurricane Season is, it also traverses some of the same thematic territory. It's not exactly in the same way as Hurricane Season. I think Melchor's work is a little bit more contemporary and more progressive, whereas Blindness is a little more allegorical and religiously influenced. If you like wading into the pools of the uglier side of humanity, then check this out. It's a really good book. As always, if you want to read the write-up that I did for Fernanda Melchor's Hurricane Season, you can head to my website. I will link it down below. I've also, of course, done write-ups for all of the other books that I recommended and mentioned. That's it.